Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Iraq, and we've discussed Iraq in the past in this context, and that context specifically being what many people would see. Iraq is becoming a theater between the U.S. and Iran, or U.S. versus Iran, in fact. We've, of course, had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil, and then the retaliation as well from the Iranians, again, on Iraqi soil itself. That very much continues at this point in time at a much lower level. Both sides, of course, striking each other in different means and ways. There is then talk right now about if the U.S. should even keep the 2,500 odd troops that it has right now in Iraq, because the argument on the part of some people is that that is, in fact, a provocation, that may very well provoke a much larger confrontation with the Iranians, again, on Iraqi soil, possibly. Is that possibly what the U.S. should be doing, i.e. completely walking away from Iraq? Would that be something that the Iraqis themselves want at this time? Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. Zana Gul Mohammed, who is a researcher and columnist on Middle Eastern affairs, particularly Iraq. He is joining us today from Sheffield in the UK. Joining us from Tehran is Dr. Fawad Izzadi, who is an associate professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran. And joining us from Brunswick, Maine, is Dr. Gordon Adams, who's a distinguished fellow of the Quincy Institute. He's also Professor Emeritus, at the School of International Service at American University. Gordon, Fawad Izzadi, and Zana Gul Mohammed, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us today. Gordon, I'd like to start with you firstly. It was the Americans, to be fair, who did strike first, seemingly, when it came to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Do you think it possibly is time for the Americans to completely walk away?
I find it unlikely, although, as we've discussed on this show before, the United States is generally rebalancing its policy towards the Pacific and towards China, and withdrawal from Afghanistan is a perfectly good indication of that. Iraq is not Afghanistan. In the Iraqi case, there are two things that keep the Americans there. One is the remains of ISIS, Daesh, in Syria and Iraq, and being in Iraq allows the Americans the opportunity to strike against Daesh, ISIS, and its remnants. And the other, obviously, as you've been saying, is Iran. Iraqi militias and informal militias in Iraq have been attacking U.S. forces as recently as 3 times in the last week. That pins down, if you will, the American military presence. It's not a large presence. It's 2,500 people, roughly. Large enough to be a declared interest, not large enough to get the United States into too much trouble. The general indication from General McKenzie at CENTCOM, the commander of Central Command, is the United States intends to stay. Although the Congress has been trying to repeal the authorization for the use of military force in Iraq from 2002, that is being basically waved aside as a nice thing to do by President Biden, but not necessarily governing of what the United States does in Iraq.
Right.
Not everybody, it would seem, in Iraq is prepared to countenance the withdrawal of American forces. The Parliament has voted a non-binding resolution against it more than a year ago. But the executive branch in Iraq is not quite as clear and straightforward about wanting it out. It is a controversial presence, not in the United States, but I think in Iraq. Yeah. It's a contested presence, and the Iranians are clearly pushing hard to try to obtain that move.
Okay, so Fawad, let's get the Iranian viewpoint on this then. Just as much as there's criticism, as you know, of American presence in Iraq, there is also, on the opposite side, criticism of Iranian influence / presence in Iraq. Do the Iranians, let me put it this way, would they walk away, in fact, if the Americans also walk away? Is it a question of who influences Iraq for the Iranians?
You know, overall, I think what Iran wants from Iraq is a good neighbor. And we remember what happened during Saddam Hussein. He was a brutal dictator. He attacked Iran. He killed a lot of Iranians. He killed a lot of Iraqis. He destroyed his own country with the help of the United States. The U.S. had a lot to do with the destruction of Iraq. So when we talk about Iran's influence in Iraq, we basically are saying that Iran wants to make sure that we don't see another Saddam Hussein in that country, because we know having a Saddam Hussein in Iraq is going to be very difficult for Iran and also for the Iraqis. That's the justification that Iran has. The United States, on the other hand, is not a neighbor of Iraq. Iraq has not attacked the United States. Iraq poses no threat to the United States. If U.S. wants to fight ISIS, U.S. has a lot of bases in countries around Syria, and U.S. could do it using the bases in those countries, or they have ships, warships around this neighborhood, and they could use the warships and other facilities that they have. So I don't think they need to be in Iraq to fight ISIS. To be honest with you, doubt how much they want to fight ISIS. If we believe the former U.S. President Donald Trump, it was Mr. Obama and Hillary Clinton that created ISIS.
Yeah.
So overall, that is not a justification. I think the Americans are in Iraq because of two main reasons. One is oil. Not that the U.S. needs to import oil from Iraq, but U.S. On geopolitical grounds like to stay in Iraq to do that. And also Israel is going to be another reason why the U.S. is in Iraq.
Zana, what are your thoughts on this? Because I would think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I would think that the Iraqis would probably just want to take the reins themselves of the situation within their country and don't want to be the theater of U.S. versus Iran.
And as you have noticed over the last 2 years, the protest movement in Iraq openly asked the foreign powers not to have conflict in Iraq and not to make an Iraq a theater for conflicts between the United States and Iran. However, I would also like to mention that the U.S.-led mission to combat the Islamic State or Daesh announced in last May that it changed its role from direct combat to support. So basically, the coalition forces have been focusing on providing support to the Iraqi army. So they are not engaged in combat. However, as the former speaker has mentioned, there are the U.S. presence in Iraq. It's controversial for the Iraqis. I agree with that perspective. I believe that the Iraqi government needs the United States, not just for the military support, but also for the international support, to galvanize international support, for economic support. As we know, that the United States and Iraq, they have strategic alliances and the strategic agreement, which includes the agreement includes multiple layers from economy and security. In the meantime, Iraq has also a lot of agreements with Iran. So both countries are important for Iraq, and we should mention that this contention, the contention and the conflicts have been started since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, and before that there was kind of tensions on Iraq, but it was not to this scale, to today's scale. So, in large, I think if U.S. Military forces walk away, it will weaken the Iraqi government militarily, because Iraq still needs a lot of logistical support, a lot of military support. And as you know, the F-16, which Iraq has, is all from the United States, and all the weaponry are from the United States. So therefore, it is necessary the military alignments, the alignment between the United States and Iraq is necessary.
Gordon, on that military alignment issue, I mean, I would have thought that by this point in time that the Iraqis would have reached a stage where they would be able to completely control things and not be even dependent on the U.S., to a certain percentage even. I mean, you would think that by this time the U.S. would have made them independent enough. Is that, do you think, almost a failing of the U.S. as well, considering its involvement, its now long involvement in Iraq? I mean, you would hope that the goal would have been independent sovereignty, for countries to stand on their own even militarily.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. The military relationship between the United States and the Iraqis is now, of course, of long standing, and particularly with the surge of ISIS-Daesh in recent years. The United States military operations, intelligence, air support, and things of that kind have been very important to the ability to roll back Daesh from the areas in Iraq that they seized and took control of. It was very threatening at one point. So the military relationship has been very deep. It's several $1 billion worth of training and assistance. There is also a big and expanding NATO mission for training of the Iraqi military forces. And that is the key, really, to the United States relationship with Iraq. It does not necessarily create independent forces, as the previous speaker was saying. The United States supplies equipment, it supplies training for the equipment, it supplies parts for the equipment, it supplies maintenance for the equipment, both directly and through contractors. So the Iraqi military is, in fact, quite dependent and interlocked with the American military capacity through the military training programs. That is also a way, of course, for any country to buy influence in another country. Is having an impact on their military, having a presence on the ground with their military, a big train and equip program as the United States has in Iraq. It is the principal thrust of American relations with Iraq, and it is tied, as I said before, to the continuing conflict with Iran, with the Iranian-backed militias, and to the remnants of ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. So there's enough of an interest there to justify, for the American government's point of view, a continuing military presence. And there's enough of an interest on the part of the Iraqi government to have that independent balance, if you will, with the impact of Iran internally in Iraq through militias and political operations.
Does Iran offer an alternative almost to dependence in this fashion as well, militarily I'm speaking, to on the Americans? Because as I've said earlier as well, there's just as much criticism, or a lot of criticism as well, of Iran in Iraq, i.e. influence or militias, however we want to term that. Or is this just for the Iranians, the fact that the nervousness about having somebody who is so dependent on the Americans right next door?
Iraq is a sovereign country, and the government of Iraq can decide whether they want to have assistance from the United States or Iran or a third country. It's not for Iran or the United States to decide on Iraq's foreign policy or defense policy. It's important to also remember that there is enough opposition to the U.S. presence in Iraq to force the Americans out. And as you have seen in the last number of days, there have been attacks in Ain al-Assad, where Americans are based, and other American facilities. There was an attack on the U.S. Embassy. And when the Americans assassinate a popular Iraqi general with Qasem Soleimani, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and when the Americans attack Iraqi forces at the Syria-Iraq border, labeling them as pro-Iranian, it's going to create more animosity and more opposition to the U.S. presence in Iraq, which is actually a welcome news to Iran, because what we see in this part of the world is death and destruction that's coming from the U.S. Army, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. And I think it's high time for the Americans to mind their own business, don't interfere in the affairs of other countries, stop occupation, stop the killing, stop wasting money of U.S. taxpayers, and also stop bombing the houses of people who live in this part of the world. And overall, I think if the Americans continue with this policy, they have to do in Iraq what they did in Afghanistan.
Okay, and I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. What do you think a completely sovereign, independent decision on the part of Iraq would be in this case?
I think Iraq should have a thorough discussion, especially, as you know, the forthcoming elections are coming, which is in October 2021. So I think the political factions and the ruling elite, the ruling elites, including the prime minister and the cabinet, they should have a thorough discussions about the U.S. Iraqi relationship, and as well as Iraqi and the Iranian and Iran's relationship, because both countries are important for Iraq, and Iraq is, as both colleagues have mentioned, the speakers have mentioned, that it's a sovereign state, and I do believe that the prime minister tries to project an independent foreign policy. However, he is increasingly under pressure from multiple sides, from political factions, from armed groups, and so on and so forth. Therefore, it is a delicate situation, to be honest, because, as we know, this government is not a permanent government, or it's not for long terms, and in few months we have elections. So therefore, a thorough discussion should continue within the parliament, within the Iraqi political theater, and so to decide what to do next.
Very well. Leave it there at that, but we really appreciate all three of our guests, Zana Gul Mohammed, Fouad Izzadi, and Gordon Adams, for taking their time out, for sharing their respective insights with us from their vantage points. We're discussing there a post-Daesh defeat, if that's not an overstatement, of course, when it comes to Iraq and the reality of this theater of war, as some may have called it, between the Iranians and the Americans that is playing out on Iraqi soil. The debate is quite vast when it comes to that regard, but it seems to have all begun, if we're completely honest, with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general. Ever since then, the tensions have been fairly high, and there have been tit-for-tat attacks at a smaller level than what had taken place in those days. Nevertheless, is keeping American troops provocative? Is that a provocative move by the Americans, keeping their troops, even 2,500 of them, in Iraq at this time? Should the Americans completely walk away? Is that what the Iraqis want? Would that be an independent, sovereign decision of Iraq, or would that be a decision Iraq would take under pressure from the Iranians? One would hope, as Zana there pointed out as well, that the Iraqis can come up with an independent process to then be able to decide just for themselves and for their own national interest what steps to take in this regard. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Afghanistan. And just yesterday or so, the United States had announced that around 90% of its pullout had already occurred. And probably by the time that we're discussing Afghanistan right now, it's probably beyond now that percentage point of the true pullout that the United States says it will have completed, well in advance, of course, of the September 11th deadline that President Biden had put in place. What does this mean for who governs Afghanistan going forward? Because as we know, the Taliban have and are at this point in time as well carrying out an offensive. The Afghan government as well as Afghan military are also very much fighting back, as are some Afghan people as well. At the same time, we've also had in Tehran a meeting between some Afghan political leaders and some Taliban leaders as well. Is there hope in such a process with, for example, the Iranians getting involved in trying to ensure that intra-Afghan talks of some sort do occur? Because that's been the hope from day one, right, ever since that deal was signed in Doha. And then on top of that, we also have the Biden administration trying to figure out whether or not it should authorize once again CIA as well as Pentagon drone strikes as well as commando raids in Afghanistan, even after the country has completely withdrawn as it has said it would. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Mariam Wardak, who is an Afghanistan analyst, the co-founder of Her Afghanistan. She's a former strategic communication international relations advisor to the Afghan National Security Agency. She's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Also joining us from Washington is Dr. Marvin G. Weinbaum, who is the director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East East Institute. He's an ex-analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan at the U.S. State Department. Marvin and Mariam, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Mariam, I'd like to start with you and start right at the top regarding the Taliban and their offensive. As you well know, Mariam, there's a lot of forecasts about what's to happen in the coming days, months, possibly even years, which are quite fatalistic for the Afghan government. Is it as bad as it seems from the outside?
When you look at Kabul, it is as bad. There are multiple assassinations on a weekly basis. Criminal activity is on the rise, aside from what the 22 active terrorist groups that the Afghan National Defense Security Forces, they're extremely stretched thin fighting the criminal activity. Now, when you step outside of Kabul, there's a difference because the foreign influence is very less, and majority is contested by the Taliban. I'm sure you've seen the AFP report of how much is contested by the Afghan government and Afghan Taliban, and how much is under the control of the Afghan government and the Taliban. And it seems that the Taliban have a bit more control than the Afghan government. And it's a very tribalistic society outside of Kabul. So I think that they have adhered to the Taliban way of governing in those areas. So within Kabul, there is a huge reality check in the sense that none of the Afghans believed that the U.S. forces would eventually leave Afghanistan. They felt that Afghanistan was such a strategic point for them, especially many of the leaders within the Afghan government. And I think that those kind of immature assessments is what has led us to the current situations.
Marvin, on that point that Mariam there mentioned about what the situation is like outside of Kabul, and indeed I have seen, as Mariam there mentioned, the estimates and the map, in fact, of control of territories across Afghanistan. I wonder where your thoughts are on what the meeting that occurred in Iran and whether or not that can actually be light at the end of the tunnel, because firstly, it's a good thing, I would imagine, that the Taliban's at least coming to some sort of a table to discuss things with at least some Afghan political leaders, even if it's not in Afghanistan itself. And secondly, do you think that the likes of Iran, for example, can take the reins of some sort to ensure intra-Afghan talks?
I personally am very skeptical about any kind of efforts now to arrange a political outcome. We're well beyond that. If it was ever possible in the first place, where I also have my doubts, certainly now the Taliban are smelling what they think is going to be a victory and perhaps even a success coming more quickly than they thought possible. But looking back at Afghan history, this is the way it happens so often. People get a sense about where things are going, and then they take their course in rather rapid fashion. So as far as Iran is concerned, Iran is an important player here and certainly will be crucial in any future of Afghanistan, whoever is in control there. But nobody is going to put the pieces together that add up to a power-sharing arrangement. What we could anticipate now is that the Taliban will come across with a peace offer. But on examination, what it really is a terms of surrender. They feel that they don't have to ultimately win militarily if they can get the kind of emirate, which is really their goal, if they can do it politically, diplomatically.
Mariam, what are your thoughts on what Marvin there said when it comes to the role that Iran possibly can play as well in this regard, as well as, of course, other regional countries? But I'm just using Iran as an example because I believe it's not discussed enough. As Marvin there said, it is an important player. It's an important neighbor. It's been affected by instability in Afghanistan in the past as well.
Realistically speaking, it seems that none of the neighboring countries really care what's in the best interest of the Afghans. They just want to make sure that they have really great cordial relationships with whoever will be in power, because it's going to impact them immediately as our regional neighbor. So I think that Iran has always had a connection to the Afghan Taliban, and this way they have, of course, confirmed it in multiple meetings in the past, where they have tried to initiate communication between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. I think that no regional country has any severe power over the Afghan Taliban. There is influence and there could be sway, but this is an organization that completely functions on its own. It is supported by many other entities, but it completely functions on its own, that has no loyalty to anyone. It has no loyalty to its own people or to its own leadership. So there's a concern there. And one thing that I do want to give credit to the Afghan Taliban is their consistency. They've been consistent on what they want, and they've been patient about it. And the fact that much of the international society, especially our international partners who are shocked by the aggressive methods that the Afghan Taliban are continuing to pursue, is very startling to me. This is one thing that they've been consistent about. The concern here is on the brain drain that could possibly happen to with Afghanistan again, which happened right before the Soviet invasion. What's going to happen? In the past 20 years, we have invested and educated in our youth, the youth that are not familiar with the Afghan Taliban, the youth that have grown up in the past 2 decades are not aware of their aggressive methodologies and have all just been told the tales. Now, the concern is if the brain drain occurs, that means that the public that will remain in Afghanistan will completely adhere to any Taliban mechanism of governance, whether that's the Emirates or any type of conclusion they come to in Doha. I am hearing that they are going to provide within 3 days to 3 weeks their terms on how they would like to move forward. If the terms are agreed upon, then there will be some sort of formation. If not, then violence will continue.
You know, Mariam there brought up a very important aspect, and I wanted to ask you about that as well, because there is, from my understanding, a significant enough amount of people who obviously have flourished under the Kabul government as well, right? Be it education, business, or otherwise, and they would possibly not just take this all lying down, right? So, I mean, they wouldn't just lie down and you know, accept a Taliban takeover, for example, of Kabul, I'm saying, or of the entire country's governance. Will that then be enough of a challenge to the Taliban that they may compromise on certain aspects?
I think most of the people we're talking about who have grown up in the last generation, and as Mariam suggests here, really have an investment in this country as it is. I don't think they can survive in a Taliban regime. Yes, as Mariam points out, people in the countryside, for the most part, can adjust. Their lifestyle is not going to change that much. And if they do leave, it's going to be for economic reasons. So I don't think that the people who have been educated now, and we're talking about millions of people in the urban areas, it's not just Kabul alone, it's really the urban centers. These people, as I say, will not have a place in a Taliban future. And that's where the first wave of refugees is going to begin. It's already started. They will be followed by, as I suggest, by people for economic reasons. It's the people who are associated with the various militias, the large and the small warlords out there who will put up a fight, and they'll get their guns and their manpower in large part from the remnants of the Afghan National Security Forces, many of whom will return and join militias.
Okay, I'm giving you the final word before I let both of you go. Just quickly, if we can discuss a future U.S. role in Afghanistan. As I mentioned right at the end of my intro to this segment, there is that consideration on the part of the Biden administration possibly to continue drone strikes and commando raids, or at least have the right to do so, as in given to the CIA and Pentagon on behalf of Biden. Is that likely then to be the role that the U.S. will continue to play, as in hands off until it feels it really needs to get involved?
I predict that is a possibility. And we have to really look at Biden's history with Afghanistan. He's had a very negative relationship, whether it was the Karzai administration and now with the Ghani administration. Recently, when Ghani's administration recently on their trip to Washington, D.C., it was stated that Ghani had asked Biden to continue its air support. So I'm assuming that this is where it's lingering from. And I think that they have to continue their air support if there is a threat to the United States. However, if it's in the best interests of Afghan or the Afghan National Defense Security Forces to make sure that they are continuing to win or to hold off the Taliban, I don't think that that's going to happen. I think that Biden has made it very clear that he's leaving the Afghan government on its own to handle its mess, or the lack of a better word. The one thing that I am really concerned about is the kind of narrative that it has continued, and the fact that we need to understand that it's not really a peace settlement. It is really a negotiation on livelihood, and the fact that the Afghan people are at a disadvantage is rightfully so. Like my colleague mentioned, they will start leaving for economic opportunities. However, the Taliban have smart in a sense that they understand that they need better relationships with international communities, and they are looking for economic opportunities. So how will this benefit the people? We just have to wait and see.
Very well. We'll leave it there. We really appreciate both Mariam and Marvin for taking their time out this morning and for contextualizing this discussion for us about the future of Afghanistan, really, because, I mean, obviously none of us have a crystal ball to know exactly what will happen, but the guesstimate on the part of everybody, educated guess that is that the Taliban may very well take over and or have, a very heightened role in governing the country. How and what form that takes is obviously something that we need to wait and see in what shape and form that happens. Will the regional countries such as Iran be able to play a positive role in ensuring that there is peace in the country, stability in the country, good governance in the country, security, obviously, for all of the regional countries, especially at their respective borders, would be of paramount importance. And what is then best for the Afghan people? As Mariam there mentioned, who is really thinking about the Afghan people in all of this? And that's the major question that I think remains an open debate. Were the Americans thinking about the Afghans when they got involved and now when they're leaving? Again, something that is worth debating, I believe. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a proposal put forth at the United Nations Human Rights Council by a group of African nations called the African Group, I believe. And they're talking about systemic racism and police brutality, not only, of course, just in the United States, UK, and other places around the world, but globally, essentially, as well as talking about things like, the racism that continues against Africans as well as African Americans or those of African descent, including legacies then of enslavement, colonialism. There's a whole host of other significant issues which come along with all that, which need to be addressed. So this group, this African group, is then calling for a proper global study to be done on this and a global investigation into this, as well as then a global effort to have pushback on this sort of racism, systemic racism, I should say, in many of these former colonial powers especially. And those colonial powers are pushing back at the UNHRC, saying that this is unnecessary at this time, that this should not, in fact, be a proposal that should be moving forward. Let's discuss this a bit further and how important then such an investigation as well as pushback would be. We're now joined by Dr. Remy Adekoya, who is the Associate Lecturer of Politics at the University of York. He's also author of Biracial Britain, A Different Way of Looking at Race. He's joining us today from Sheffield in the UK. Remy, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today. How important is it for there to be a global effort in this regard? Because so far we've seen individual countries, especially these former colonial powers, as I mentioned, saying that they're essentially, for lack of a better word, policing themselves on this issue.
I think it's very important for us to globalize the race issue. It has too much been centered on the Anglo-Saxon part of the world. So it's been a very Anglo-centric debate so far. So essentially focus on what's going on in the US and in Britain. But in the US and in Britain, there's a combined 42 million Black people who live in both these countries. There's 1.3 billion Black people in the world. So just 3% of the world's Black population actually lives in either the US or the UK. So really, if we want to talk about racism seriously, it has to be a global discussion. Look, there's 55 times more Black people in Brazil than there are in Britain. There's just 2 million Black people in Britain. And there's 5 times more Nigerians than there are Black Americans. And I'm talking about Nigerians, and there's people who live all over the world, and there's people experiencing racism, in Russia, in Poland, in other continents also. It's not just a case that Black people experience racism in white majority countries. And the way I see it, a lot of this really boils down to economics, actually. Because if you think about it carefully and you analyze the global picture carefully, you'll find that the racial hierarchies which exist today are essentially a faithful reflection of the economic hierarchies which exist today. So we really have to start from that.
So what are we trying to achieve here through such a global discussion to globalize this issue? Because as you well know, and as I mentioned already, a lot of these colonial powers are already pushing back at just the idea of doing this. I mean, this hasn't even begun yet. We would need to map this out, certainly, and I imagine that would take a significant amount of time. But considering that pushback from these colonial powers, what do you think that they fear will happen if this does go through?
I think what they might be fearing is that it's a pathway to a demand for reparations. I think that's what they'd fear. So if I was in their position, that's what I would fear. That this is a way to sort of open the discussion, highlight sort of at a global level some of the lasting effects of slavery, colonialism, and then on the basis of such a UN report, then start to demand a significant amount of money in reparations for what was done. So I think that is precisely what they fear.
Let's talk then country by country, right? So let's talk about the UK for a moment, because that's where you're sitting, and I think that would be the best vantage point to discuss right now. Just, of course, as an example, and you're correct, of course, that there's a lot of other countries around the world that where this issue is a very important one. But in the UK itself, looking at what's happened just over the past few years, right? So we've had the BLM movement that was sparked from the US, of course, but then it's very much a reality for people of color in the UK as well. What do you make of, how do you assess, let me put it this way, government's reaction to this overall?
So I think there's been an effort to at least try and be seen as doing something. And we can see this in both the public sphere and in the private sphere. So perhaps even more importantly, there has been a push in the private sphere. So, with regards to companies, corporations, the private sector, where in a lot of cases, especially at senior level, ethnic minorities are underrepresented, and Black people are definitely underrepresented. There's been a sort of push to try and change that, to try and address that. And, we'll see how that pans out in real life. Like we know, words, in the George Floyd event was a cataclysmic event. And obviously after that, there's a whole sort of moral atmosphere created around race that, we need to do something about this. We need to do something about this. And now everyone wants to be seen in Britain as doing something about it. Of course, the question is, in practical real life, are there actually going to be things done about it? And, can this actually improve the situation of Black people living in this country? And with regards to that, the jury is still out. That will take a couple of years. And of course, it would have been silly and naive to believe, the race issue can be resolved in a year or 2 years or even 5 years. It's a long drawn out process. And like I say, human beings are very good at establishing hierarchies, in various ways. People establish financial hierarchies, people establish racial hierarchies, which, like I argue, actually stem from financial hierarchies. And so, to sort of dissuade human beings from, establishing hierarchies and to sort of stop people from that, human beings like to have this sort of, I am better than you feeling. And people look for various ways to establish that feeling. Now, race has been a very good way for white people to establish that feeling over the past 5 centuries, and there's still a lot of people who enjoy having that feeling. And so, to dissuade human beings to sort of, move back and sort of resign from those feelings of, we are better than you, it's not an easy job, and it's, there's a lot of this, actually stems from human nature. It's not like, white people just are some, sort of inherently different human beings from the rest of us. They're not. And we share the same flaws they do. Where they are advantaged is, again, I say, in the fact that they control so much of the world's wealth. That wealth gives them a lot of power in the world. And that is why we are worried and people are concerned about white racism. That's why, there are and not many, but there are some, black
Remy, I do apologize for interrupting you. I do sincerely apologize. Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us. I just wanted to get one final word from you, if I can, about this issue of white people, right? You know the arguments on the opposing side, right? And I'm talking a lot of this within the context of the U.S. because that is what's spoken about more around the world and understood, is that a lot of the Caucasian community, if I may put it that way, then feels that they are under attack now. It's almost reverse racism, and I'm sure you've heard that phrase as well. Is there any legitimacy or authenticity to that argument then?
First of all, the concept of reverse racism is a nonsensical concept. People either hold racist views, by which I mean they feel a particular racial group is inferior or worse than other racial groups, or they don't hold such views. And of course, all sorts of people can hold such views. White people hold such views, some black people hold such views, some Indians hold such views, some Jewish people hold such views. So of course, anybody can hold such views. But the reality, of course, of the power dynamic is that black people in the UK make up just 3% of the population. So essentially, the reality is white people don't need to care whether black people have racist views or not. Yeah. Black people cannot afford not to care whether white people have racist views or not, because white people make up 85% of the population in Britain. So it really all boils down to that power dynamic, not who holds really racist views or not. In real life, the people who bear the consequences of racism are the weaker groups. That's just the reality of it. The stronger groups, they don't have to care about it. They don't have to bother what others think about them.
Well, Remy, we'll leave it at that, but I know we just touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this issue. It's a lot more vast than what we've been able to discuss, but we really appreciate, nevertheless, you taking your time out today to share your expert insight with us. So it was Remy who was speaking to us there from Sheffield in the UK. We were discussing this proposal by a number of African nations at the United Nations Human Rights Council that there should be a proper global investigation, a proper global then push to address things like colonialism, then as well as systemic racism that has then come out and has been rooted in colonialism, as well as, of course, other root causes as well. And it's not just limited, as Remy there correctly said, to just the Anglo-Saxon world. We've seen this in Brazil and many, many other parts of the world. If it's not just black people who are the targets, then it's different people of color or just people of dark skin in and of itself. So that colonialist mindset almost, if I may use that phrase, does exist in a lot of the parts of the world. And that in and of itself also needs to be tackled, which is beyond then just targeting governments and colonial powers. The colonial powers, as I said, have though pushed back against this proposal, saying it is unnecessary at this time. And we'll wait and see, of course, if this does happen, because if it does, I would imagine that it would be a significant undertaking on the part of the United Nations. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.